The brutal, senseless murder of Daniel Shaver has had many a corruption pundit in an uproar for a couple of months now. To them, this is clearly proof of the corruption and complete lack of government accountability in this country that needs to be rectified. I've actually put off talking about this incident until now, because I wanted to wait for the excitement of the hour to die down, and to look at the matter with a calm, objective mindset, one that isn't tainted by rage or confirmation bias. My judgment after doing that? Daniel Shaver's death was entirely unjustified, and yet Philip Brailsford's acquittal of that murder was an accurate verdict, both at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Political Conspiracies Debunked. Before anyone posts a hate comment, let me start off by pointing out that, in absolutely no way, shape, or form, am I arguing that Daniel Shaver deserved to be shot. Quite the opposite, in fact. Not only could the police have easily de-escalated that situation without the use of force, but it had already been de-escalated by Daniel Shaver himself. As soon as he saw the guns pointing at him, he did what any sensible person would be expected to do. He dropped to his belly and put his hands in the small of his back. He was submitting to being arrested. As far as my response to that is concerned, the Young Turks honestly took the words right out of my mouth, so I'm just going to go right ahead and quote them directly.
I don't understand. Why doesn't the cop walk over and put the cuffs on the guy?
Just put the cuffs on him.
Walk over and
put the fucking cuffs on him.
What are you waiting for? Why you got to make him go through a monkey bars? Why are you doing that?
That's exactly right. At that point, the situation had been de-escalated. It was the cops, not Daniel Shaver, who re-escalated the situation. They wanted Daniel Shaver to put his hands in the air, not in the small of his back. Since when did cops have the authority to demand their personal choice of civilian submission poses? Daniel Shaver had submitted. It is absolutely clear at that point that Daniel Shaver had submitted. But that wasn't good enough. They wanted Shaver to assume their preference of submission poses. Their personal preference of submission poses carries absolutely no weight. So the defendants argue that Daniel Shaver could have had a weapon and could have been reaching for it. Well, to that I say, it ultimately doesn't matter, because anything after Daniel Shaver's unconditional surrender to the police was manufactured by the police, either for their own sadistic pleasure or to give themselves an excuse to kill him, or both. So instead of walking up to him to slap the cuffs on him, they instead demand that he crawl towards them. Why? Why don't you just do your job? There's no arrest at that point. There's no law enforcement. There is no interest in self-protection. At that point, you're just humiliating Shaver for its own sake. So at that point, even if Shaver A had a weapon on him and B was reaching for it, it still doesn't matter, because at that point he would have just been defending himself. There was no arrest at that point. You can't resist arrest if you're not being arrested, and these cops were not arresting him. They were just humiliating and terrorizing him simply to get their own jollies off. But then they argue that they had to do these specific submission poses because he could have had a weapon and they needed to safeguard against that possibility. To that I say, what exactly made him likely to have a weapon? Just the fact that he, in theory, could have had one? I understand that the cops were called to that scene because a civilian saw a person waving a gun around in the window. But how did the cops know that Daniel Shaver was the one with that gun? Honestly, couldn't anybody, at any one moment in time, have the possibility of having a weapon on them? Literally anybody. In this crowd of hundreds of people, can you point to anyone who we can safely assume doesn't have a weapon on them? If we accept the cops' logic and follow it to its inevitable conclusion, then we may as well forget about human rights altogether. The USA becomes a full-blown police state at that point. At that point, cops would have the authority to do this kind of gunpoint shakedown on literally anybody and their mother, including children and the elderly, because they could have weapons on them. At that point, if it's a choice between a few cops getting shot because someone had a concealed weapon and the cop didn't account for that because the odds of him having a weapon were too small, and a few hundred civilians getting brutally murdered just because they didn't assume the exact specific submission poses the cops wanted at any one point in time? The former seems like the lesser of two evils to me, because at least the cops know that the career they've chosen is dangerous and they accept the career despite the risks, whereas the civilians do not. But, in spite of how utterly senseless and unjustified Daniel Shaver's murder was, there is still one mitigating factor that makes Philip Brailsford's acquittal justified. Brailsford was not primarily responsible for Daniel Shaver's death. What? Now don't get me wrong. The bullets that caused the death of Daniel Shaver did indeed come from Philip Brailsford's gun. However, that is where Brailsford's involvement in the murder ends. Think about it this way. Suppose one of your loved ones has just been executed on death row. After his death, it is revealed that he was actually innocent of the crime for which he was executed, and his wrongful conviction was caused because the prosecutor in his case knew about some exonerating evidence and purposefully concealed it so the defense couldn't use it to exonerate your loved one. Who should go to prison for your loved one's death? The executioner who personally put your loved one down per the death sentence that was imposed? Or the corrupt prosecutor whose corruption actually led to the death sentence being handed down? Well, I don't know about your personal preference, but in the eyes of the law, the latter is the one who most deserves to be held accountable. Although actually getting the prosecutor to be punished is easier said than done. That's basically what we have here in the case of Daniel Shaver's murder. You see, after Brailsford was acquitted, The explosion of news media coverage the case received made it seem like Brailsford was acting with complete autonomy in that matter. Not only was Brailsford the one who shot Shaver, but he was also the one giving these ludicrous and humiliating commands to Shaver because he wasn't satisfied with the submission pose that Shaver assumed on his own. But in fact, that's not the case. You see, body cam footage is not entirely flawless or foolproof. One major flaw of body cam footage is that it doesn't show us what is happening in the cop's peripheral vision. And this is such an instance where that flaw is rearing its ugly head. The person issuing these ludicrous and humiliating commands was not Philip Brailsford. It was Police Sergeant Charles Langley. According to this article written by Arizona Central, while Brailsford's trial was still ongoing, at one point in the video, Shaver puts his hands down and behind his back. Langley, who was in charge and the only one yelling out commands, quickly orders him to put them back into the air or else he would be shot. So there it is in black and white. Brailsford might have been the one who shot Shaver in the end, but the decision to shoot him simply was not Brailsford's decision to make. Brailsford had been given direct orders from his commanding officer to shoot Shaver if he lowered his arms again, and Brailsford was simply following orders. At this point, even though the situation was clearly manufactured by the police, it was Charles Langley, not Philip Brailsford, who should have been punished for manufacturing this situation. Daniel Shaver needn't have died, but that doesn't mean that Philip Brailsford should be the one to take all the blame for a situation he didn't create. Brailsford is just as much an innocent bystander of Charles Langley's bullcrap as Daniel Shaver was. This is a classic case of you've got the wrong guy. Or as the YouTube channel Officer401 put it,
and if anybody's to blame, it's the sergeant.
So this is still a case of government corruption, but the corruption lies in a separate part of the case than we previously thought. This is a case of the real culprit being let off scot-free, while the government goes after an innocent man to create the illusion that they're doing their jobs. It's just like in the Harry Potter books, when Rufus Scrimgeour falsely imprisons Stan Shunpike to create the illusion that the Ministry is fighting back against the Death Eaters, when they really are completely incompetent. That, ladies and gentlemen, is where the real corruption in this case lies. So I would like to ask you all to think long and hard before you throw your middle fingers at literally anyone and their mother who you think might be guilty. When you hear of a tragic story like this one, take a deep breath and try to obtain all the facts before you jump the gun. No pun intended. Also, I would like you all to take a look at the first video I uploaded to this channel. It's a documentary that describes how we can reform our government without the government having to give its approval. It doesn't require a civil war or riots, nor does it require the government to consent to our reform movement. It's all 100% legal, and the civilians are all taking the matter into our own hands. This documentary is 6 hours long, but don't get discouraged by that. The description of that video has a table of contents with timestamps you can click on to take you straight to the sections of the video you care about, and skip the parts you aren't interested in. I have divided the video into 3 distinct titles. Title 3 of that video is where I discuss my plan to reform the government. But that's a video that's already come out. For today's video, I bid you all adieu.